Welcome in, everyone. Thanks for joining me on the Buddhist Wisdom Podcast. Today, I have the honor to talk to Shawn J. Moore. Welcome, Shawn.
Hey, Scott. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to share space and conversation with you.
Of course, man. So for some of you who aren't aware of Shawn's awesome work, I just want to share a little bit from his bio, and then we'll jump into our conversation today. So residing at the intersection of leadership and mindfulness, Shawn J. Moore creates sacred spaces for stillness and self-inquiry to help social impact leaders align their strengths, intentions, and impact. Through his integrative approach, he holds transformative containers for self-renewal, personal discovery, and capacity building that ease clients on their journey towards peace, clarity, and freedom. Shawn is committed to empowering change makers to become embodied leaders, unified in mind, body, and heart, with the tools to mindfully pause, reconnect to their inner knowing, make strength-driven decisions, and lead the change they believe the world needs. Shawn has an intuitive way of weaving all that he has learned on his path to help those on the inner journey of discovery, including meditation, sound healing, yoga nidra, and coaching. Thanks. Sign me up, man. That sounds good.
It's always awkward hearing your bio. I'm like, oh, okay.
It's true. Every time someone reads mine, I just sort of, stare down a little bit. Welcome again, and I just wanted to kick our conversation off and also help our viewers, our listeners, to get to know you a little bit more, and just hearing kind of your origin story. I think on this podcast, obviously my podcast is based around Buddhism and meditation, and I would just love to know how you came to both meditation and Buddhism. Like, what's your origin story?
Yeah, I love that phrasing, like origin stories. The superhero nerd in me is like, yeah, that's cool. I like that. I would say for me, I actually got connected to Buddhism from high school. There was a book that I read, I think in 11th grade in AP English called Siddhartha.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the book that sort of cracked that open for me in a really interesting way. I've always been like a information seeker, learning, sort of taking in a lot of information and things like that. And so when I read that book, there was something about that sort of like piqued my interest in a different way. And so then, I'm in 11th grade. I'm a kid still. I started going to like Barnes and Nobles and just sort of sitting in like the world religion section and just sort of reading books. Didn't have the money to buy them, but was going in and like just sitting and reading the books, going to the library and learning more about Buddhism, and particularly meditation in itself. And I would say fast forward to being an undergrad, there was a lot of time where I felt like I was like in the closet with meditating, where I would do it sort of in my own room, not necessarily telling my friends about it because it wasn't like as popular as it is now.
Yeah.
I had a few friends who were in.
What year was this around, just more or less?
This might have been, I want to say maybe around 2006, 2007-ish, probably around that time. And I had a few friends who were like into the spiritual stuff, like they were into yoga and like numerology. So like we kind of got together because we were, the weird kids into the spiritual stuff. But even through that, the practice of meditation really stuck with me. And I realized, and I think back then I didn't have the language, but there was something so centering about sort of finding that level of stillness when the world was so noisy sort of around me. And so that was something I sort of held on to. It helped me in instances where I was like leaning into grind culture and hustle culture. In that sort of overachieving space, I know I can naturally sort of fall into, and sort of like coming back to center and sort of pouring back into self. And then, I moved to Atlanta back in 2014, where I was like, cool, I could actually explore this thing for real. So I was going around to a lot of different Buddhist and Dharma centers here in the city, sort of trying out, and then I didn't have names. I didn't know names. I just like, it's all Buddhism. I'm just going to pop into a lot of different spots. And it was very much Goldilocks, like sort of going to different spaces, seeing how it felt. And eventually I ended up landing at the Atlanta Shambhala Center, where I'm like, oh, there's something about the approach here that resonated with me. And sort of that's been my consistent, I would say, home sangha that I get an opportunity to work with. And then I took my refuge vows right before the pandemic, 2019, December 2019. And then most recently took my Bodhisattva vows last October, which was really sort of a nice reminder and realignment that I needed, connecting back to the path in that way.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, I'd love to come back to that, talking about bodhicitta, the Bodhisattva vow, that alignment you're talking about. Bookmarked in my mind, hopefully. So, I got kind of like two follow-up questions. One is like, what drew you to Buddhism in general? Like, what were the aspects? And then, when you ended up coming to Shambhala centers, what drew you into, I think of that more as like Trungpa Rinpoche's mandala and how he talks about Dharma. So I'm not sure if that was some of the influence for what kept you in that place.
Yeah, I think for me, what drew me into Buddhism is that there was a simplicity to it, and there was an openness to it as a philosophy, as a spiritual path, and there was agency to the practice and the philosophy that drew me in a way that, again, as I look back on that time, I realized I needed. And I think about the story in Siddhartha around like really choosing the path that resonates most with you, no matter sort of what the external world is really pushing and pressing you towards. And there was something about that narrative that sort of looped me in, right? And I talk about this a lot in my work that, I think as being a Black queer man, sort of navigating the world does a lot to sort of try to tell you who you are. And there was something about Buddhism that sort of turned me back to self to sort of figure out an answer and work with that question in a way that felt more authentic and engaged in that way. And then particularly what sort of landed with Shambhala was, there was like a lot of synchronicities. I realized that, so I'm like a huge Pema Chodron fanboy. Like any of her books, I'm with. Comfortable with Uncertainty probably is my favorite book from hers, and that's the one that I sort of go back to the most. But I realized there were a few folks that I followed in the space, particularly like Pema Chodron. I picked up Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche's books, David Nichtern. There was a few folks, and the more and more I started realizing like the differences in lineages and approaches to Buddhism, I'm like, oh, I think that's why it's all resonating, is because it's sort of all in the same sort of family tree here. And so I try to listen to a lot of those synchronicities to be like, I think this feels like home here. So yeah, that's sort of what drew me in. As I was sort of doing that exploration, I was sort of deepening a connection to some of the teachers that I followed and realized that they were sort of along the same path too. So that felt really good and aligned.
Yeah, beautiful. I want to, if you could help me to remember, there's another bookmark here coming back to identity and how this relationship of the Dharma, the Buddhist path, to how we hold our identities, how we work with those, because you brought that up. And I think that's a real important key I'd love to discuss. So I'm going to bookmark that too. So you've been teaching meditation for a while. So based on kind of meeting the Dharma, practicing meditation for a while, what drew you into teaching meditation and how did that start for you?
Yeah. I've always say like, I came into the space really sort of on like the yoga path as well. Yoga was something that was really important. My best friend at a very early age got her yoga teaching certification. And so a lot of her practice teaching classes, connecting to the practice around her a little bit more and learning more. And so sort of dabbled in meditation, particularly from like some yogic and tantric perspectives as well. And there was something about wanting to share the stillness and groundedness that I was afforded to other folks, particularly other folks that look like me or identified like me. And I think early on in the space, there wasn't a lot of folks teaching. And for me, it felt like a responsibility. And I'm like, understanding sort of how things are landing for different communities. It's like, those are the communities that need it. So like, how do I get meditation into those spaces to help people find that level of stillness? But I think that aha moment came from just the realization of what meditation had done for me. And then sort of creating the space to begin to teach it. I ended up doing a yoga teacher certification, and then some meditation teacher certifications eventually. And then sort of use that to sort of pivot and start teaching meditation, particularly from, different lineages and different perspectives, but really holding space, preferably in community spaces, right? And I think that's where I got a lot of my teaching experience from, was like actually working in communities here in Atlanta, and bringing it to spaces. I know that my first opportunity to teach was actually for a nonprofit here in the city that was designed to bring like wellness services, where I know we talk about the idea of like food deserts, but one of the things that isn't always explored is like health and wellness deserts. And so there were spaces in Atlanta where like there was no gym, there weren't any sort of like mental health services, there weren't anything like that for folks to sort of tap in. And that nonprofit's sort of goal was to bring affordable classes into those spaces. And so that was where I sort of got some of my first teaching experience and really sort of realized like, okay, this is the lane that I see myself working in, to continue to sort of bring this work and help other people connect to it in an authentic way.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. And you bridge right into my next question on sort of your work and the communities and people you tend to serve. And it was interesting because I didn't know that about you until you just said it, that you, like the community actually teaching serving the communities you do and the people you tend to serve. That's what actually drew you into teaching, which I think is a really unique. That's not how most of us start teaching. We're not like thinking, I want to serve these particular people and help in these particular issues where, as you said, there might be a wellness desert or things like that. So I would just kind of love to hear part of that process for you more, and also more about the communities,
Yeah. And it's interesting because I took a career pivot, and I think part of it was like connected specifically to that. So full time for the last like 12 or 13 years, I worked in higher education and student affairs. I worked at a few colleges. For those folks that might know, here in Atlanta, I worked at Savannah College of Art and Design, and then also at Morehouse College before I finally transitioned out of the work. But part of the work that I was doing there was around student development, leadership development, and training in that space. And so sort of understanding the impact there, and then sort of noticing what does it look like to connect meditation and mindfulness to this idea or concept of leadership. And so that's where sort of I got my interest in it. And in the work that I do in higher ed and student affairs, for me, it's a focus on working very specifically with diverse populations. And so as I started to like get into this almost like parallel career track where I was like teaching and, associate dean in the daytime and then going to teach these classes in the evening, I realized that there was actually a connective tissue there, right? This sort of interest to sort of help and pour back into community. And so when I realized that, that actually was the thing that gave me the courage to sort of step out. Because I know for me, I think about purpose a lot. And for me, I know a lot of that is centered around like holding space for others, for them to do that sort of self-exploration. And when I realized, I was like, oh, in meditation, that is a space for self-exploration. That is a space to sort of see the world from a different perspective, to see ourselves in the world from a very different perspective. And that sort of was my goal in higher ed, to help students sort of connect to themselves in a really unique way. And when I made that connection, I'm like, I don't think I have to deal with this political mess here in higher ed and colleges. Maybe I could step out and actually sort of lean into this piece, as that is sort of more and more connected to sort of where I see myself in that. And so that's what sort of helped me pivot and sort of move into the space of working directly with community. Because at that point, I was working with community through the lens of working on a college campus.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing is for you, there was that you called it political, but that there's it was a barrier to service is kind of what I'm hearing a little bit, right?
That is a nice way to put it. Barrier, yes. It and I think for me, the higher I got into the roles that I was in, it was one less connection to the students, and I think more and more I was noticing sort of incongruencies on what we knew our students needed and what the university and colleges were open and ready to do. And so it was that sort of friction that I'm like, this isn't feeling like it used to feel. And so noticing like, what is it that I can do in this? I've done the good fight for a really long time. And it's like, well, what if I tried another approach to sort of continue to do the work?
Yeah, I think this is what drew me to you. I mean, I was on your podcast recently, and we connected with each other also in a class I was doing. And then when I just getting to know you through being on your podcast and having some conversation before and after that, this is one of the things that drew me to you, because I'm particularly interested in how we serve in the most direct way with less barriers, and that doesn't have to look a certain way. That can actually be through any medium. But I'm interested in that pursuit. So I really like hearing other people's process with that, because it's often not an easy one. Because often I don't know, for you, for me, there's a lot of risk taking involved in trying to directly serve. And, my style is more just like trying to show up with as little veneers as possible in relationship, and just being there in that interaction as much as I can, whether it's a group or an individual or whatever in my life. So yeah, just kind of curious, anything around that for you, because you seem like someone you obviously, like, you had that moment where you realized that, and then kind of what's been the process since then of just sort of trusting that, I guess.
That's a great question. It was a very difficult decision. There was a lot of friction there on trying to figure out, is this what I should be doing? Right. I know I had the sort of like the feeling sort of in my heart and my gut around like, this is the path in which you need to be on. But I think to your point, it was like, how do I take that first step? Right. And then eventually I just had to do it. Now, it was very difficult. I told myself, I tell my friends this whenever I remember the day that I stepped away from higher ed, that I was like literally in my office, damn near having a panic attack, to like actually go talk to my supervisor about like, hey, I want to formally put in my notice. But after doing that, there was a lot of sort of relief and spaciousness to think differently about the work. And I always credit, like, my practice helped me work through that, right? Like it was, for me, it was like actually the meditation in action, right? Like taking the breaths, being connected, sort of understanding and finding that balance and flow to be able to realize that this is the right decision to make. And the process leading, after that, has been very interesting, right? Like, I had some opportunities to work in nonprofit for some mindfulness education organizations, and then I ended up transitioning to working with one of the mindfulness apps that are on the market. And that was the position that I think I needed the Bodhisattva vows after to sort of help realign me, because that was a position really focused on community. And so for me, that was like, oh, cool. I'm working directly in community, helping folks connect specifically to the product, to the practice in that way, almost like an ambassador for the practice of meditation through the app. And then there was a company-wide shift, right? So there was like, we don't really care about community. We really just trying to get more people to download the thing. We don't really care about the community piece. And for me, there was a major jolt in that sort of feel, right? And so, when I ended up eventually taking another step and another leap, realizing that I can't stay there when it's a space that sort of feels incongruent to my values, it also made me question placement and work, and like, am I actually doing the right thing? Am I in the right path? And so, like, actually taking the Bodhisattva vows was a nice sort of realignment to come back to that and say, like, cool, your work is about being in service to others. This is a dedication, a rededication to that, to something you've already acknowledged years before. How do you get yourself back in alignment? Especially in that sort of few months where, like, that was space where anxiety, depression sort of came up because of that sort of incongruency and friction with what I had started to comfortably get into, realizing that this is sort of the lane or the space in which I want to move in.
Yeah, I mean, so much there, and thank you for reminding me of one of our bookmarks, or one of my bookmarks, but in our conversation. Yeah, I mean, I think you're kind of hinting to something that I find quite interesting because for me, I would love to hear kind of how you think of the Bodhisattva vow. For me, it's a set of commitments to both waking up, but also waking up in connection with others, and a set of vows or principles we live by in order to, bring efficacy to that. But, there's this edge where, that's not, we're trying to let go of the ego. I mean, for most of us, it doesn't come all at once. It's slowly. Well, we're doing that. So, I mean, the Bodhisattva's vows are mostly, I think, for me, I don't know about you, they're mostly about relationship to undermining my own ego clinging so that service can happen in a more fluid way. And yet, all that happens for me, and I'm hearing for you, and I want to hear more through the edges of where I meet, my own limitations, fears, etc. Whether that's a fear about like, how do I survive? How do I continue to do this? And am I good at it? Am I not good at it? People, like all those fears that come up, and the truth is those just get in the way. And so how to open up that space of just being there fresh, like, I don't know, really good Tibetan Buddhist teachers, because they're kind of my examples. They embody this. They seem to they gather things like a king or a queen, and then they just flow, and all of it comes in, comes out, and it's all in service. So kind of wondering what you think of that, and also your kind of practice of that, your experience of that.
Yeah, I think we're definitely in alignment with that. And for me, one of the things that drew me to, like, prior to actually taking my vows, because even during the pandemic, I was kind of like, is the Shambhala Center, y'all going to offer it? Are y'all going to offer it? And it just so happened that the day I resigned from that meditation app, my position there, I checked my email and I got an email from the Atlanta Shambhala Center. It's like, hey, seeing if folks are looking to do their vows. And like, for me, it connected directly to the idea of like servant leadership, right? And sort of tying back to the concepts of leadership and noticing where these things intersect, right? And I think about servant leadership focusing on serving others. Like, it's less about the hierarchical need of somebody, this dynamic of power over folks, but it's more about how am I working directly with people to be of service to their specific needs. And so as I was reading and learning more about the idea or the concept of bodhisattvas and then the vows itself, for me, that was just, it felt in direct alignment with sort of like what I needed to be reminded of, because, back in college, back in my creating leadership trainings, like servant leadership had always been the core or the leadership style or philosophy that I always push towards the forefront, that I think we need to be of service to other people. One of the things that I think I was reckoning with, and I still reckon with the idea or concept of bodhisattvas, is this idea of foregoing your own to, help other people get free and doing their thing, and sort of contending with the idea of what do we do? How do we do that in a sustainable way? That it's not, because I think about folks who do a lot of community work, who do a lot of movement-based work, and it's easy for folks to like burn out, right? Yeah. We see like all the things that are happening in the world, and we need everybody on the front lines to do the things to sort of help us sort of dismantle the things. And how do we do that in a sustainable way where we're not literally setting ourselves on fire to be of service to other people? And so, I think that was the thing that I sit with quite often with the vow. And also, I think that's the thing that I sort of keep at the forefront in being of service to other people. And so it creates a nice, like, intentional reminder in practice of like, cool, we're going to be in service. We're going to do the things for the other people. And how do we take care of self to continue to do that at a level that still feels nourishing for the folks around you and for self?
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And I think, often this area you're mentioning, for me, it has this kind of intersection of how we're holding on to our idea of being of service. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. That's been my kind of exploration. So So kind of curious, and I'm happy to say more, but I want to leave more space for you kind of around that, because you talk about burnout, and I notice, I don't know if I burned out, but I can get sort of stressed and or overwhelmed when I'm really caught up in my own idea of what something needs to look like, or accomplishment, or like that doing mentality around something, or trying to be a savior to someone, and that's been kind of my process of letting go of that over the years.
Yeah, I would say for me, I think the thing that I've been keeping in mind or trying to keep in frame around that practice has really been like serving or giving from the overflow or the excess. Right. And I think sometimes folks who are in service spaces and service work, because there is such a passion to help people, we will help people until like we're on E, right? That there's nothing else in the cup. And realizing that in doing that, we actually aren't probably showing up the best way for folks when we are sort of doing that on E, right? Knowing that we're not necessarily centered, we're not aligned, we're not doing that from a place of rest and nourishment. And so for me, it's been sort of centering the idea of it's okay to take care of yourself, because also in that, it provides a different level of capacity to be present for other people. And so sort of like framing that and sort of also contending with this idea of like rest, right? That we're not always incentivized to slow down to find rest, and knowing that like even in utilizing practices to sort of help find that stillness and that opportunity for silence or just self-inquiry, that part of that is the work too. And so sort of looking at opportunities to sort of work through that, and realizing that's a whole lot of conditioning, right? Like socially is not there's so many different signs to say that, hey, slowing down, your productivity is your worth in the world, right? And so like actively, that's, I think, a piece that sits in my practice often of like contending with like productivity, worth, rest, and sort of what that sort of looks like, particularly in the work that I do.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. That productivity thing is huge. I think that's the majority of it for me, and sort of can drive what I think should happen rather than just showing up for what's happening. I think that's a big one. I think that, because you're saying you work at an intersection with folks also who are working as activists or working in community projects, and I think that's one of the challenges, because there's an idea of an outcome there, or maybe an outcome that we're fighting against, right? Or trying to think of another way to say that. Opposing. That's the word I was looking for. So I don't know anything else there on that kind of tension there, of like.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, and I think it's also sort of helping other people work through that processing too. Like for me, I think in the last year or two, my shift has really been less like teaching meditation classes and more like working specifically in the training space to help train other meditation teachers. And I think for me, that's been part of it, of like creating the space for them to slow down and explore, right? And realizing that, hey, there's another way to approach the work. There's opportunities to sort of come at their lives in a different way. And it's in that helps them sort of show up as better practitioners or teachers, right? Because I think so often, to your point, there's an expectation typically at the end, right? Where like we think about training spaces where it's like, I want to be a certified such and such to do this with folks. And part of the way to get there, right, is less thinking about becoming a teacher or getting certified, and like, how are you actually implementing the things that we're working with and we're talking about, right? Actually living in that space, and then allowing yourself to sort of teach from that transmission, right? From the natural sort of resonance of what is present for you as you are actually on your journey doing your work and in practice with the practices that feel good for you. So it's sort of helping people sort of redirect that of like, cool, end goal here, we get it. Yes. In this moment, how can you actually embody this, right? Like, I know I had a conversation with a student that's in my meditation teacher training, and She was like, I give a lot of readings and it's a lot. And they always joke and say it's like getting a master's in meditation. And I'm like, but y'all be good afterwards though. Y'all are good afterwards. And she was just mentioning like, it's like, yes, there's so much going on in life. I'm trying to get the readings in. I'm trying to do all this and I'm trying to make this happen. And I was like, well, stop. Just realize that the things that you're reading, the things that you're working with, the concepts and your practices should actually help you show up in that in a much more. So don't think about it as this separate, hey, I have these things to learn and then I'm living life over here. But how do these things actually sit together? Right. And sort of there's an interesting way that we can start to sort of work with that to sort of help us lean into that. Like it's less about the teacher part, right? More about just let me live life in a much more centered, grounded way in which I'm starting to see things as they really are.
Yeah. Beautifully said. That's been my insight. Like that all the work has to go into that, letting go of the idea of what it looks like to do a role or serve, and just showing up for life, because it's, we're the prism we're seeing things through. Our mind is the prism we're seeing things through. I think, yeah, very well. Yeah, completely agree. Just to pivot a little bit, kind of going back to now, it sounds like you're working mostly in training others, but it sounds like it's related to serving populations who tend to be affected by those wellness deserts you were talking about. And I just kind of want to, was curious from your experience. I'm assuming communities of color, right? Also, maybe queer communities, or queer communities of color. And tell me if I'm wrong, if that's a wrong assumption.
No, you want it.
So then, what do you see the needs? Like what do you see are the how do you say, like, what needs do you see in those communities? Because a lot of us, especially folks like me, we don't get to see the needs in those communities often, unless we work directly with them. But, I think it's important that one's, how do you say it? The person in the front of the room's body should reflect the bodies in the room. So I think it's okay that some of us do other work, right? But I'm just kind of curious,
Yeah, and that is pretty much the focus of my work. Full time, I actually now work for a nonprofit called Beam that is really focused on trainings and programs specifically around like mental health and healing justice in the Black community. And so we do a lot of like trainings and programs in different cities that create those spaces. And I think for me, to answer your question, I think what's needed is like, and what I'm noticing in the work that I do there and in the work that I'm doing like in my own business is that folks just need that space to be. And quite often in maybe like majority spaces or other like prominent spaces that we see around, that folks don't often feel comfortable and sort of figuring out what that balance is of, creating spaces that particularly are in service of those communities, and noticing that if folks are in spaces where those spaces don't exist, how do we make the containers, the spaces, the sanghas that are already created more welcoming, more equitable to folks who do join and who are present in those spaces? Because I think quite often the barrier is a level of comfortability, right? That like, I'm not necessarily sure if when I'm in this particular class or in this particular center or in this particular community that they're speaking to my actual lived experience. And I know that there's a lot of there's difficulties in space holding when the identities are different and not necessarily maybe having that language. But I think to your point, as you mentioned, like noticing where folks can uplift voices in those communities if they already have the platform, or being in service and support of spaces that are being created specifically for those communities. But I think the biggest thing is folks having a safe space to put that armor down. Because I think the world for so many communities, right? And not just the Black community, just not queer. We see what's happening for our Jewish folks that are out there, for Latinx folks, right? There's a lot happening in the world for women. There's a lot happening in the world that is kind of attacked, not even kind of, that is really sort of focusing in, dialing in, and pressurizing different communities. And so folks just need a space to be so that they can come in and let some of that armor down to sort of be present to what's there. And I think sometimes that's the initial block that will have folks in spaces And then like I can't even listen to the what's being shared. I can't drop into the practice because I'm sort of tense in a way that the space isn't necessarily conducive for me to sort of soften and relax into.
Yeah, yeah. You know, and even just as a, I guess European bodied, person, my ancestors are European for my body at least. Um, a lot of those kind of, I'm just going to call them white dominant spaces, but we could probably use another term. A lot of those spaces don't feel comfortable for me sometimes. I mean, I feel comfortable, I feel safe, but I'm not necessarily like thriving. Just because my background being like ethnically Jewish and Italian, sometimes that's not, there's a little bit of a disconnect. So even for some of us who would identify as white, we can sometimes also feel kind of, I don't know. But at the same time, like if I go to a majority Black community, I also am like, that's not my culture, and it's very obvious. But at the same time, there's something beautiful there I want to be a part of, sometimes, because I think there can be joy. I mean, this is another topic, but I think sometimes a lot of white dominant spaces for me, they lack joy, and there's like an over seriousness. And that sometimes I respond to that because there's a tightness in my body that has been influenced by that my whole life, and I've been trying to shed that tightness. So sometimes living in Latin America, these other places, I get into spaces that they're not mine, but they help to influence me and like rebalance some of that.
Yeah, and I think to what you're naming, I do think that probably the second thing is more open-mindedness, right? Like to your point, there's space for us to learn from everyone in different opportunities and ways. And, you named something that I like to talk about a lot. I was like, the world is very heavy. We got to bring like joy into the space too. It's one of the reasons why, like, for me, I love comedy stuff. I love all of those kind of things because I do think sometimes in our spaces that it can be very serious and like we're doing the thing, and that is important. And it's just as important to sort of bring joy and like happiness into the spaces. And I think part of that also is in community, right? How can we just create space we don't have to talk about the heavy things at the moment. It's important to address those and work with that. And how do we create just as much room for like joy and play as well?
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I think some of that. I mean, I think there's this fight right now because it's sort of like people, we want diversity, we want integration, but at the same time, as you named, and I've come to see this working with a few communities of color in meditation and just, all kinds of communities. There's an absolute need for like, it's okay to just have a community be one culture, one people. Like that it's not bad, like we don't have to always mix things together is kind of what I'm saying. And I know that sounds a little controversial, but I think you know what I mean by that. It's sort of like let people have their space. You know what I mean? And like
definitely with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm definitely with you. I think it is important for folks to have spaces, and I think it's equally important for spaces to be welcoming of all, right?
Yeah.
And sort of striking and finding that balance. But it's really important. I think that there are lived experiences for every identity group that needs space to thrive and live and to be seen in community with each other in a way that's really reaffirming too. And so I think quite often when we see like Black-led sanghas or queer-led sanghas or women and femme folks-led sanghas, like it's cool and it's needed, and it's spaciousness for that to explore, particularly like whatever spiritual path or the Dharma from that particular lens, right? And sort of understanding how is it speaking to that identity or the body in which you inhabit at this moment, very particularly to that experience. And so it is important. And how do we make all the spaces equitable too, so that, when folks inevitably come over and head to a different space or a different sangha or a different center, that everyone feels sort of welcome and comfortable to be able to drop in and be present for a community.
Yeah, I really like that. To me, that I like that. I'll just frame it as an aspiration you just shared. I mean, it's a reality in some cities and places, but I like that aspiration because for me, it's like how to hold those two. And that kind of leads me into my second bookmark around identity in Buddhism, because I think there's this edge here often where, in Buddhism, we're talking a lot about non-duality, identitylessness, kind of letting go of boxes, letting go of things. And at the same time, Buddhism talks a lot and a lot of the teachings are on how to work with relative reality, you know, which includes our identities, includes our ethnicities, includes our bodies, all of it. And I think this can be a really challenging and confusing place for us when we're going on deeper dives in Buddhism. And of course, I'm kind of mostly curious about your exploration about that, and with that, if it's up for you, but also just the sense of navigating that, because I think we're already starting to name it. Because for me, like that's one example where like you should have affinity groups and or just groups of color, and they can do their thing, and white people don't have to be involved in that. And like we can sit out, let people have their space where they can take their armor down, and then we can also have spaces where we work together. And I think this is one quick point I want to make for our last comment. I think what I've come to realize in my own body, which is part of that is unpacking some of the dominant behaviors and kind of culture that I've been influenced by in the United States. And that's always changing for me what that means. But also this sense of how do you say it? Yeah, this relationship to that it's okay to be different. That's what I was trying to.
Yeah.
I almost lost my idea there. That it's okay to be different. Like, why do we? I think the United States has this obsession with trying to make everyone the same because it's a melting pot kind of. So then there's this idea everyone's got to melt in the same thing. But what is that? And I actually think being different's okay. Just honor each other's differences. We know it. Like for me, it's like I don't take offense if someone knows I'm a white dude and they call me that. You know what I mean? I take offense if they don't treat me like a human being, because of that. Right. So yeah, that was just one point I want to make, side comment, but.
Yeah, as you were sharing that, the thing that came to me is like the differences are our superpowers, right? And I think that part of sort of my exploration of Buddhism and the Dharma has created space for me to sort of see the world as it is, right? And so like understanding, right, that like there's Buddha nature in everybody, in every sentient being, right? That is present, right? Even the most hateful person, even the person who is potentially trying to cause harm, understanding that and realizing that the world that we live in, that doesn't absolve them of, behaviors, actions, and choices, right? And just understanding that it provides, I think, a really interesting way to just see the world as it is, right? And I think this for me always goes back to like the idea of suffering. And I know when I initially got, and I think we talked about this, I think in one of our conversations, I think in my early exploration of Buddhism, I was like, damn, it's all about suffering. Like this is depressing. But I clearly didn't go to the rest of the noble truths, but realizing that like what we see in the world is the product of suffering, right? And understanding people's true nature. So I think a lot of that has provided opportunity for me to work with that in a lens that makes everything much more workable, right? To be in conversation with folks who are in different learning points or spaces in which they are connecting to people and realizing that like, cool, this is a challenging conversation. You got the Buddha nature though, so we're gonna have to work through this and realize that like, okay, that's suffering talking. I know what that is. How do we sort of work with that? And I think that it's provided an opportunity that no matter how heavy the world is getting, like watching the news, seeing the alerts on our phones, we are creeping into a headache of an election season, that it all feels workable. Right. I think that's what I think the practice has done, making this sort of idea. And I think it's probably one of the reasons why Pema Chodron's work resonated so deeply with me, because I think a lot of her work is centered around like working with discomfort. And I think that's sort of the inevitable thing that we are sort of all rubbing up against of like, ooh, this interaction was uncomfortable. And on the other side of that discomfort, there's something we can learn. There's a new way to see things. There's something that we can let go of and drop. And so how do we sort of work through that instead of working around it or not addressing it, right? And so I think that's sort of where it's landed for me, is just realizing things are workable. And that workability is like, how do we sort of move through this discomfort in a way that we're honoring that true nature that we all have, that basic goodness, that Buddha nature that is, present in all of us.
Yeah. Beautifully said. Yeah. And I was thinking, some people, we just have to say, I know you got Buddha nature, now get the hell out of my house. Like
Yeah,
sometimes
that
that's
part
okay.
too. And sometimes that's the workability. Like that's the workability.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay. No matter how much that Buddha nature is there, this ain't getting through. So you're gonna have to work through that somewhere else.
Exactly.
And that's part of the work too.
I agree. I love that you use the word workability. To me, that's kind of like, I don't know where you're pulling that from, but it really, because I read a lot of Trungpa Rinpoche, so that harkens back to like a term he would say or something like that. And, and Pema Chodron, of course, because she's one of his students. And yeah, I love that word because it's like,
Me too.
He pointed out, he points out so much in a lot of his books, everything is workable. We need to just show up for working with it, because workable doesn't mean like correct or how do you say it, kind or compassionate. Workable means we can work with it, like we can approach it.
And I always look at that for me when I see that in his writing, like workability or workable means possible, right? Like there at some point there is some way that we can break through or work through this. It might not be in my interaction with you. It might not be in the next interact, but at some point there is an opportunity to sort of see the possibility of the other side of that. And so, that's something that I feel like is really important. Even as we talk about this idea of like bringing joy in a space, I think that's also sort of a space where like hope lives too, right? That if things are workable and things aren't always going to be as gloom and doom, and we think about the impermanent nature of things, that cool, there's an opportunity, there's spaciousness to sort of get to the other side of things and sort of see things from a different perspective.
Yeah, yeah. If you're up for it, I would love to hear also some of your personal journey struggles with this intersection of like the identities you hold and work with in your body, as well as these teachings on non-duality and identitylessness in Buddhism. Like, how does that converge for you? What's that work look like for you?
It's an interesting convergence, right? Because I think we think about non-duality, and then what often is real in the work is that it's easy for folks in bodies that look like mine or other marginalized communities that like folks get tokenized, right? Like I think about sort of the racial reckoning that happened in the summer 2020. And we had so many organizations that were doing the Black Squares and all of these sort of things. And then like trying to do some work to like platform Black and brown folks very specifically with that, which again, I think is right step, great way. And what does that look like, sustainably, right? That I've seen so many instances and even opportunities that I've been, a part of that like will create the space to lift you up. And the moment that socially things die down, it's like, okay, we're going to sunset that program, or we actually don't have that money for that anymore, or yeah, we're not going to do that. And so noticing where I think for me, that interesting piece is like working with how other folks are viewing that identity and showing up in space and sort of trying to be mindful of that. And noticing like when inquiries or connections are being made, like how is that really showing up? And is that a way or opportunity to say like, look, we got a Black guy here, or we got a queer guy here in the whole lineup of, 20 white teachers. Is that a gesture of moving in a direction of more equitable spaces and, lifting voices, or is it an instance of checking boxes, right? And so that's something that I think that I've struggled with and sort of in a level of discernment sort of try to work through. And also knowing and naming that there are a lot of places that are doing that right and that are sort of doing the work to create more spaciousness, creating those affinity groups, bringing in teachers to teach and hold space and sort of share from their particular perspectives. And so I try to hold both of those two truths at the same time of like, capitalism is always going to make folks jump to the thing that's hot in the moment and then drop it when it's not hot to move to the next thing. And there are people genuinely holding space and creating space to, allow and use privilege to sort of lift up voices and opportunities for folks who might not necessarily have had those opportunities, prior to.
Yeah. That's it. I don't want to go into my, I have had my own journey with this just as a white body male. And I think, um, a lot of it's been around just what you shared of like dealing with my stuff, not to let my uncomfortability dealing with folks who come from a different background or the idea of like, race and racism in the United States, because we all grow up under that in some, in our own side of it, right? Um, how to not that let that influence a personal relationship with someone, especially in a professional way, like you were just sharing. Because yeah, I saw that tokenization starting to happen to friends, still happening, and I'm
Mhm.
happy for them because I want it. I just think they're great people and usually, great teachers, and so I want to see them doing their thing. And yet, I feel why does it have to be that way? Like it's for the I don't want to be so cynical, but you were pointing to it that it's really for the organization to look good. So it's quite a selfish action actually, and I don't think it really moves us forward socially and culturally. So and this is stuff you already know, but it's interesting to me, and I like what you said, and that's kind of been my approach. It's like, where do I have the opportunity where I feel I can authentically lift something up? And I even had this question come into my mind as you were talking: does something need to be lifted up? You know, it's like a semantic maybe because I know what we mean by that, right? Meaning just like a voice that isn't heard in the mainstream as much, lifting that voice up, but I definitely don't have to lift anyone up. You know what I mean? Like that's the conclusion I've come to. I mean, generally, I get lifted up by more diversity. Like living in Latin America. Having a connection to Black culture through my dad, through jazz, and studying jazz growing up. Like that's lifted me up, actually. You know, so I don't know. Just throw a little.
No, and as you were sharing that, what also came up for me is like I'm with you because like words mean something, right? Like I don't know if it's lifting up, but I think
Yeah,
creating space, right?
yeah, yeah,
That
yeah,
I think sometimes there's instances where those voices are stifled, right?
yeah,
And or don't necessarily have the same sort of platform. So what does it mean to make space for those voices? Because to your point, I think that when everyone has an equitable seat at the table, no matter what the space is, everybody's lifted.
yeah,
Right. There's a different sort of richness that is present for all of us culturally when we're all
yeah,
connected in that way. And so yeah, I think it's how do we make more space for folks,
yeah, yeah. Love it. I love it. um, Shawn, just before we kind of wrap up a little bit, just anything we haven't talked about yet that you'd love to discuss or kind of share with those who are listening or watching this.
Yeah, I thought we touched on a lot of the things. I think the only other thing that's coming to mind for me, which is, I don't know, this feels like a present conversation. I just did a workshop yesterday with the Accessible Yoga School. They're doing a course like making meditation more accessible.
Hmm.
And one of the things that sort of came up is this idea of like us actually doing the practices, right? Like I think, and this is coming up for me because I think I'm also in the process of rereading spiritual materialism as well. And it's this idea of, and I think culturally this sometimes happens, is that we're just in spaces trying to collect different spiritual practices and
Yeah,
in certifications and all the things. But I think one of the things that we're always looking for different lists or different ways to hack the thing and do the thing differently. But part of I think the work is us actually just doing the practice. Like there's something about just showing up and doing the thing, instead of trying to like circumvent what that process is. What's the shortest way for us to get the effect and all of those things, and really just actually
yeah.
creating space, and actually doing the thing.
Man, you're speaking to my heart because this is like my passion. It's like, you know, if someone's coming to me and they want to teach meditation, and again, we've talked about this before, and I don't want to bag on it. I think we all got to, if we can do what we love and also pay our rent, that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, I'm often sad because I'm like, oh, you don't want to just come to learn how to practice more and to like deepen your path, really? And of course, they want that too, but that's not the thing that comes first. So I'm with you. I would love to brainstorm that too, because I'm always trying to find ways to gently, without being too confronting, to gently let people know, hey, why don't you work on this? Why don't you work in these areas? Yeah.
Yeah, it becomes, I don't know. I always think about, and I'm not sure whose quote that was, but it's like, um, the thing you're looking for, the magic you're looking for is actually in the work.
Yeah.
Right. And again, I feel like there's always this sort of like, I want the end thing. Like, I want the thing, but the path to get there, I'm trying to find the shortcut. And in reality, like, the beauty is actually in the sitting and being in the practice and contemplating the things and creating reflections around what it is that's coming up for you. And so for me, it's like, that's also why it's really important to like create the space for people to do that. Right. And I think there's so many different ways in which, that those end goals people are meeting, right? We can hop on Google and see 4,000 different meditation teacher trainings. Here's like a 2-hour training to sort of allow you to teach meditation, right? A very big shortcut. And what does it look like for you to actually sit, practice, and be with that, to actually teach from that wellspring of what comes up for you while you're on your cushion. And that for me is always really important. Like, I always, in my meditation teacher training, like, we're not about to learn anything. We about to sit here. Let's talk about what your practice is. What are the barriers? What are the hindrances? What are the things in which are keeping you from that level of consistency? And how do we work with that first, creating that foundation before we even talk about you sitting at the front of a classroom or on Zoom teaching somebody else? And so, like, for me, it's almost like disguising the medicine in candy. Of like,
yeah, that's a great analogy. Yeah.
You're coming in for this teacher training, and now that we're here, let's sit down and be present with what our practice is. And just know that by the time we are at the end of this experience, with the sort of way in which we can reapproach your practice, that's where you would teach from.
Yeah.
That's what you teach from,
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. We're very much aligned. I think when people come to mentor with me, and want me to help them become a better meditation teacher, I just say, hey, I don't really do that, but I'll help you to become a better meditator, and then just like you said, that will of course have its effects. And if someone continues to serve others, that'll have its effects in how they do it. I mean, this is the advice my teacher gave to me, Sunny Rishi. He told me many times, transform yourself and just let that naturally, sort of display or just sort of be there for others. And it's kind of like, I've thought about that over the years, because it comes back to our sort of conversation of productivity, that so many of us are sort of so prone to looking towards outcome and sort of, conclusion, that we're not sitting with the moments fully that we could be in each moment of our work and life. I mean, sometimes we are. And so I think that's the challenge. And what I've noticed in really developed practitioners is they're not coming with a pre-plan. They are just who they are, because they transformed their mind and brought out their Buddha nature more, or completely. And they live their life from that place. To me, that's the essence of what the Bodhisattva vow is also there for us to practice, to be that. And I don't know, I really aspire to that. That really inspires me. And of course, and I aspire, but it inspires me these days, that sentiment around, I don't have to be anyone. It's really helped me to let go of too, when I get tripped up in reputation stuff. And, it's just like, okay, like, just work with it.
Yeah. And I just love that circling back to like just being who you are and showing up and realizing that that's also part of the work, right? And it's one of the reasons, going back to sort of my working community, it's like, I'm about to show up how I show up. And that's going to be with a fitted cap on and some Jordans, and being fully present in that way, and realizing that like part of that is like, I'm going to be me, and there's no costume to put on. There's no other way to show up, but just to be authentic and try to live that, and notice how that sort of goes hand in hand with the Dharma, with the work, with what it looks like to be on the path. So, yeah. Beautiful
note to close out on. And Shawn, thanks so much for being here. And I feel like we could go on Yeah, for a few hours just chatting. I'm enjoying this a lot. I mean, we're hitting some pretty big topics that I think are deserving of a new look or a new outlook. You know,
Yeah.
so I love these conversations. Where can people find you? I'll post it in the YouTube video and on social media. But where can people find you?
Yeah, website, ShawnJMoore.com. Best place to find me. You can join my mailing list. There's some free practices and things there for you to tap into and connect to. And then Instagram's always a good place. It's ShawnJ_Moore. I follow back. So yeah, those are typically the best places. And if you're looking for like upcoming events or things that I'm working on, there's a section there that sort of has the calendar and you can tap into whatever's coming up next.
Cool. Thanks, Shawn. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us and share your wisdom, life experiences. It's really beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. This has been like a great conversation. It was great on the other end on my podcast, and I was just thankful to be able to have this conversation with you. So thank you. Yeah,
thank you, man. Yeah, and for folks out there, I'm on, go check out Shawn's podcast. I'm on there, and among many other great, guests. Yeah, not that I was a great guest, but many other guests.
You were a great guest. Yes.
Thanks so much, Shawn. I appreciate you, man.
Thank you.